I call the member for Whitsunday.
Thank you, Mr Acting Speaker. And it's quite incredible to hear the government today and over the past week announce how proud they are of their tackling the cost of living crisis, and also how proud they are, and certainly how proud I am, of the region I represent and the massive workforce that I represent that go into the Bowen Basin every single day and mine that coal that this state then enjoys those royalties from. Our greater Whitsunday region, by the government's own admission, received $623.4 million from the capital program, the lowest investment in capital program in the entire state, behind outback Queensland. That is what the Palaszczuk Labor government think of Central Queenslanders, think of the communities of the Mackay-Isaac Whitsunday region and the good, hard-working coal miners that drive in and drive out every day, risking their lives on the Bruce Highway and then out on that road, out to the Bowen Basin on the Peak Downs Highway, where we see some of the highest death rates in the state, Mr Acting Speaker. So our region represents that large workforce, and to see $15 billion in royalties and see very little return back to the region that I represent. And I take a closer look at the capital investment, and I wonder, where has the funding gone? It's not gone into new boat ramps. It certainly hasn't gone into improved roads. And when it comes to energy infrastructure, Mr Acting Speaker, I point to the massive announcement that we saw earlier this year, the Pioneer-Burdekin hydro project, Mr Acting Speaker, now being affectionately known as the hydro hoax. And why do I think it's a hydro hoax? Well, it might have something to do with, Mr Acting Speaker, the fact that there's been no business case, that there's no environmental impact statement. In fact, the feasibility study wasn't really made public. Or is it the fact that not one community leader from industry right through to the mayor had ever even heard of the project, Mr Acting Speaker? And I'll take the House on a little reminder journey. This announcement of the Jobs and Energy Plan was announced just post the federal budget. On the same day, Mr Acting Speaker, and it was Police Remembrance Day. And the reason I know that is because I was at the Police Remembrance Service in Mackay that was held up late by the Premier, who hadn't arrived on time because nobody knew the Premier was coming. But the Premier was coming not to attend the Police Remembrance Day. The Premier was coming, we thought at the time, to announce and release the full inquiry report into the Mackay-based hospital maternity and gynaecology disaster, Mr Deputy Speaker. But no, the Premier was there with her ministers, the Minister for Energy and the Minister for Water, to announce the Pioneer-Burdekin hydro, which people that day, that morning, received a phone call saying, would you like to come along to a press conference, because we're about to announce something exciting for your community. We then saw the glossy brochures, Mr Deputy Speaker, that do not depict and are not images of the Pioneer-Burdekin pumped hydro location, Mr Deputy Speaker. In fact, that location is set between two subtropical rainforests. And I note that the Minister for Environment is in the House, and I congratulate her on the reshuffle and her portfolio. I suspect she's probably the only minister who was very happy with the reshuffle, Mr Deputy Speaker. And so, on behalf of the residents of the Greater Mackay region, and given the importance of this project to the state interest, and that it is the cornerstone of an energy plan, to give a surety to the residents of the Pioneer Valley and Mackay, I put on the public record an invitation to the Environment Minister, who I know had representation when the Labor conference was up in Mackay. And that's another point, Mr Deputy Speaker. Not only was there another announcement in the opening of a hydro office in Mackay the day before the Labor conference, but it also coincided quite rudely with a civic reception of Australia's worst air disaster that my community, the Mayor of Mackay, was hosting for 3 international American visitors. A very important day, because yesterday it was 80 years since we saw the tragic loss of lives of American servicemen at the Bakers Creek air crash. But the Premier decided to drop into town that day with no notice and open an office. And instead of the Mayor and other civic leaders being able to attend that opening, we were doing the right thing and attending a civic opening. But obviously, that's not all. The hydro plan also was so important, and they're undertaking those pre-drilling studies, that they decided to choose, the Department and Queensland Hydro decided to pick World Environment Day to commence the drilling. So, Mr Deputy Speaker, I have to say, when I see an announcement and then we see a budget with over $15 billion in royalty revenue and a cornerstone energy plan that is all about one project, the Pioneer-Burdekin hydro project. But yet we have not seen the Environment Minister go up and inspect the Youngler National Park that has over 1,417 recorded species. We've not seen the drillers place and put on record a platypus management plan, which is what they should have done. We have 3 critically endangered species, 8 endangered, 6 vulnerable and 6 near threatened. So for this, the hypocrisy of this Labor government, who holds their environmental credentials so high, I have to say, when it comes to this plan, whether it's in my community or across the state, I can tell you it's almost farcical. It's something out of utopia. Mr Deputy Speaker, I'd like to move on. We've had a decline in road funding across my region of 31%, right in line with the capital investment. And the roads funding, no funding for my local roads, Mackay-Bocasia road upgrades, where I see the highest population in Mackay growing, and the minister continues to ignore pleas for our congestion and the risk that that road poses, because it is one way in and one way out for 23,000 residents, Mr Deputy Speaker. We see no increase in Bruce Highway mitigation funding, and now we see the combination of Goganga Plains study and the Hamilton Plains study being part of a coordinated approach to address flood impacts on this location. While I'd like to inform the Minister for Main Roads, these 2 water courses are 15 kilometres apart. One cuts off the Airlie Beach community to its hospital in Proserpine, and the other one cuts off the entire community to its airport. And what did we see announced in this budget? A business case which still has not been completed, that was meant to be completed at the start of this year, that won't be completed by January next year, Mr Deputy Speaker. It's not good enough, and it's certainly not good enough when we are looking down the road of an Olympic Games where we want to showcase the great global brand which is the Whitsundays when it comes to tourism investment, Mr Deputy Speaker. I'd also like to draw the House's attention to the lack of funding to deliver. It's been committed. It was announced by the former Minister, Kate Jones, who came to Proserpine and announced a renal dialysis unit. And now, 3 years later, we still don't see the renal dialysis unit delivered. I beg the Health Minister to fast-track that. I have people in their 80s risking their life on the Bruce Highway several times a week to go to Mackay when they should be able to access that service in their hometown. And I want to commend my Proserpine Hospital. They do an incredible job with very, very little, Mr Deputy Speaker. I'd also like to acknowledge the funding that was given to my schools, Proserpine State High and Proserpine State School. My schools are continuously growing and struggling with the population growth that we see surged in the Whitsundays, and I do acknowledge those commitments by Minister Grace and thank her for that investment in the upgrade of classrooms and specialist services there. I also acknowledge that the council in Mackay also received significant funding in regards to the Bloomsbury water supply upgrade, which was desperately needed to increase and ensure that we've got drinking water for the long term, a basic that many, I think, take for granted. Mr Deputy Speaker, I'd like to point now to areas of my shadow portfolio. The Commission of Inquiry last year for the government to finally appoint an independent implementation supervisor to oversee the implementation of Hear Her Voice recommendations didn't come soon enough. It's critical to ensure that those measures are implemented timely and are evaluated. With statewide DVO breaches that have increased by over 50%, and I was in Townsville last week, we're still awaiting the announcement that was made a year ago to come to fruition of the high-risk team in Townsville, and also the Mount Isa high-risk team, which is still out on tender process, and I urge the Attorney-General to ensure that that is also finalised, because it is women's lives that are at risk. The forensic lab, the biggest maladministration ever overseen, I believe, by any Queensland state government. The implications are yet to be realised for victims of crime, but the budget line allocated in this budget certainly outlines an admission by this government that they have failed. They have failed victims of crime, and what this means for our justice system, what this means for victims and the trauma associated with what is to come over the next decade or more, Mr Deputy Speaker, is something that should not be forgotten but also needs to be put under the spotlight each and every year that passes. I also want to outline, I do acknowledge and recognise the government's further contribution into domestic and sexual violence services, and I certainly hope that the Attorney General, old is new again, sorry, that the Attorney General does confirm funding to the Red Rose Foundation, who were left in limbo after the department not releasing their evaluation and confirmation of funding. The Red Rose Foundation do incredible work, and I know that that is supported by both sides of this House, and I want to make sure that they are not forgotten in the change of machinery of government. I'm sure, I'll take that interjection, I'm sure there are members in this House who will be advocating very strongly. Mr Acting Speaker, there is funding that addresses low female apprenticeship retention and completion rates. However, this funding has come nearly 18 months after the state government's report into the issue, which recommended urgent action on the issue. The report detailed completion rates for Queensland female apprentices in male-dominated industries being at least 21% worse than that of their male counterparts. That's certainly something that we want to see, and I know the private sector, particularly in the mining and services industry, are doing their bit. I do want to acknowledge the government's announcement of free kindergarten. It has been welcomed. What I would say is I hope that that commitment is not just a shiny announcement, and that there has been detailed planning, that there are educators ready to go, and kindergarten classrooms that are ready to be built and open by schools starting next year, because that is something that many, particularly our most vulnerable in our community, will rely upon. The gender pay gap still to be the second worst in the country, a difference of nearly $14,000 per annum. And I do acknowledge the women's budget statement this year, and it's a lot meatier than it was in previous years. And I also acknowledge that the Minister for Women outlined also superannuation differences and gaps, which I believe I raised in the House last year in the budget statement, where it wasn't outlined in too much detail. Mr Deputy Speaker, I would highlight, though, that when it comes to budget and it comes to announcements, that's really important. But what has to follow is action and real action. And I can't let it go, Mr Deputy Speaker, but to see the Minister for Women denigrate another woman of this House because of her career and her service to nursing, and the way that that was done, Mr Deputy Speaker, is not becoming for the Minister of Women and not becoming of any female member of this House.
Order,
Mr.
members.
Speaker.
The House will come
and
to order.
I will call it out every time for what it is, Mr Deputy Speaker.
Order, members.
And it is shameful. It is shameful. And
you have the call, member for Whitsunday.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. There are nurses all across this state who have accreditations to train.
Order, members.
To train.
I will warn members under standing orders from now on.
And the fact that one member then decides to give up that career to come and serve as a member to better inform public policy and to legislate, and then is criticised for doing so by a senior minister of the government and the Minister for Women is disgusting.
The member for Mansfield is warned
Speaker.
of the standing orders, and there'll be more to follow if I see them.
Thank you, Mr Acting Speaker. The Women's Budget Statement is, as I said, outlines a lot of, I think, substance, which is very important and very critical to closing the gap. I do want to point out, though, that the new Housing Minister raised previous that the opposition doesn't come with any ideas, and we didn't actually touch on any solutions. So I've got some solutions for the new Minister for Housing. The Minister for Housing could, in fact, approve the Mackay Community Housing stock transfer, of which, when I was a director of the company and a former deputy mayor, met with the former housing minister on the 31st of May 2018. That is 5 years ago. We'd been advocating 2 years previously, Mr Deputy Speaker, still not signed off. So if the Minister for Housing could sign that off for the Mackay community and get that done in the next 6 months, that would be incredible. What a win. I'll give her another idea. If she could fund over 50s housing in the Whitsundays, where the council has actually donated the land and the community are fundraising, and we have repeatedly called for state government funding, there's another solution to help close that gap for women over 55. And in fact, What else the Minister for Housing could do is maybe investigate the fact that our refuges, when it comes to domestic and family violence victims, are so full. Hotels are so full. There are no rental properties, there are no social housing properties, and women are sleeping in cars with their children. If the Minister for Housing could work with the Minister for the Prevention of Domestic Violence, that would be fantastic and a great start in closing the gap for women who are most vulnerable and at risk, who have been failed to be kept safe by this Labor government.
Speaker.
Thank the member.